Hi. Okay, so we're here again on Facebook Live to really explore how emotion is energy and how when we're feeling great, then that's awesome. Obviously, our energy systems, our entire internal and external energy are in a good way. Awesome. Of course, when we're not feeling great emotionally, when something is essentially getting stuck in our energy systems, then that's when emotion can really become more of a challenge for us. So I've really loved working with these Facebook Lives to explore how we can transform that energy when it is stuck. Lovely. So I'm going to wait until a few people are on here with us because I'd really love to answer your questions as well around what can you do? What's the grief themes that are coming up for you? How does things get stuck for you? Hi Claire, I see you there. And Anna. Hi Carol. Gotta love that cup of tea. Because all emotions can be profound, of course, depends on our relationship with them. But grief generally is a very, very deep emotion. We've talked about anxiety and courage and sadness, and grief definitely in all of these moves internally in a way that's much stronger than most other emotions. And of course, grief's a perfectly normal emotion. Hi, Sarah. Grief's perfectly normal. There are things that we are going to grieve in our lives. There are people, jobs, experiences. Maybe you grieve your youth, animals that we lose, or even grieving for things that we thought might occur in our life that haven't. So grief really a very big emotion, and it touches many of our energy systems. Hi Beth, hi Nancy, lovely to see so many of you coming on now. And one of the things, hi Hilary, one of the things that makes grief quite unique in all of the emotions is that energetically, the breath supports grief. Might sound a little bit odd, but our lungs have an understanding of carrying energy into the body and helping energy leave the body. Yeah? Our lung system, our respiratory system, is a very powerful one in the overall energy management in our body systems. Let me just see who else. Hi, Valerie and Claire, Carla. Ava, congratulations. You're saying this is the first time you've been able to get to a live Facebook. So I'm really glad that you're here. Ingrid as well. Really lovely to see so many of you wonderful people. So thinking about grief. Grief doesn't come in on the breath. Grief is something that the breath supports, so that when we are experiencing grief, our lung energy will carry that grief everywhere in the body. So it becomes held energetically, even at the cellular level. It gets carried into the depth of the chakras. It gets carried all the way through the aura. So actually, I think of times when I've really experienced big grief in my life, and my aura is full of that grief. It can even look like it's like it's dripping in grief. And similarly, especially when we go through what I call a really intense grief, we're literally working with the loss of a loved one or unable to move easily through a recent loss in our life. And that can also be exacerbated if the loss has been shocking. If we have been working with saying goodbye to a loved one over a period of months or years, and then that loved one dies, then the grief tends to move in a different way. No less profound, but it doesn't carry the aspect of shock to it. While when we lose somebody suddenly, unexpectedly, then the shock can really what's the word I'm looking for? It makes the grief in the system very brittle. It makes it kind of like lots of interlocking pieces that come in and they stick together. And even when you get breaks in that grief, actually it's a brief break, but before the grief coalesces again. So grief can be something that is an ever-present experiencing for many people because of that. Carol, you have a question. When there is a delay in realizing the loss, the shock sinking in of a loved one, is there also a delay in the energy? Often it's up to 10 days before they accept it. Yeah, definitely. There can be, grief has, it can come into the body in waves, and those first waves have a lot of denial to them as well. And also the questioning, more than denial for most people, I'd actually say that the questioning of like, well, what does this mean? What does this mean to my daily reality? What does this mean to my heart? What does this mean to my social network, to my place in my own life? And as all of those questions are coming up in the middle of an intense grief, then definitely our relationship to understanding that grief, to it becoming a kind of a realization in the daily and other understanding of that can definitely take, as you say, 10 days, even longer. There can also be a part where our energy system is actually letting go of the energy system of the person who has transitioned or who has lost our life. You know, grief doesn't just have to be about death. When we have a relationship breakup, that carries grief. If we lose our job and are made redundant, that carries grief. So although I'm sure some of the questions will be around grief, meaning the loss of a loved one, the experience, the energy of grief comes in many, many different parts and places in our life. All right. So Sarah, exactly, you're talking about your grief from losing your sister from a shocking sudden illness and death. And absolutely, when shock accompanies grief, so a sudden redundancy, a sudden death, grief can be also about the loss of your physicality. If you've gone through an accident and maybe now you're much more limited in what you could do, if you've become disabled in some way or very limited physically, then there can be a lot of grief around that. So when we're thinking of how that grief is in the energy system, with its brittleness, with its movement inside the body system, then it can be an energy that can be quite difficult to move from. Fortunately, there's many things that we can do to help alleviate that, and I'm certainly going to be sharing them here. But it's that understanding that the grief travels in, and once it's in, it gets popped into all kinds of places in your energy system. All right. Lovely. Hi to lots more of you that have joined. So let's have a look. Grief has the ability to stop us from accessing our groundedness, and that is then very essential for how we can actually move that grief through our system. And so I know we've talked about groundedness in other of these Facebook Lives, and I've got a lot of blogs about it on my website as well. My new one, pruneharris.com. Don't be looking for Imaginal Health because it's not there anymore. So pruneharris.com has a lot of the blogs about grounding and videos for grounding as well. Because if you think about what we've been talking about, the way that grief comes in and coalesces in the system, the way it interlocks and has this brittle quality that keeps reforming itself, then actually it really inhibits our flow. It inhibits it inhibits our expansion. Yeah, because of the brittleness that can happen in many places in our energetic systems, then we can no longer flex and flow, expand and contract, which is what we need to be healthy. when we're in a place, and we've all experienced it, when we feel, wow, I'm pretty expansive today. And then other days when you think, oh, I'm fairly internal, I'm constricting in today. And that's healthy. That's the natural way. Just as we breathe in and expand and we breathe out and we constrict, that ebb and flow is very, very natural and healthy to our entire energy system. But when a pattern comes in that restricts that in some way, so actually we can no longer flex and flow, then that's where we begin to start to experience chronic emotions or chronic illnesses. One thing we touched on in an early Facebook Live, but I want to bring in here, is that emotions, when they become stagnant and stuck, as you go on through that experiencing of days, weeks, maybe months, maybe years, then that is going to have an effect on your physical body. And so emotions have a direct correlation to your ability to be healthy, not just emotionally healthy, but physically healthy as well. I know that in the past couple hundred years, we've divided emotions and physicality. We've divided heart, body, mind. But actually, holistically, we're getting ever closer to the understanding that everything is connected. And just for a moment, you think about times when you've really struggled emotionally, when maybe you've really struggled with grief or sadness or depression or anger, and the way it starts to show up in your physical body, maybe after only a few weeks. So when we've worked with grief in our system and we've got this kind of static brittleness in our energy system, then at some point it's going to show up in your body system. And very often, because of this tight connection between your lungs and breath and grief, very often it shows up in respiratory problems. So, for example, a close friend of mine lost his wife in December one year. And for several years after that, he had a chest infection in December, because as the grief began to really be revisited at that anniversary time, then actually his chest, his lungs couldn't keep an equilibrium. That place of static, of brittleness would come in, and he would get really, really severe chest infections for several years until that grief was able to move. All right, let's see if there's any questions. Hi, Els. No questions coming in. Obviously, I'm talking enough to keep your full attention and not let you think about any questions. But obviously, if you have any about grief, then pop them here so that I can really address what your questions are around them. So let's have a little think about ways that we can actually help transform grief, because the opposite energetic and emotional balance to grief is trust. And sometimes that's not an obvious leap, okay? It doesn't necessarily feel like trust and grief are different sides of the same emotion. But when I see people who are experiencing grief, and when I look at their energy systems as they move from grief, what they move into is trust. And it's a way where they understand that they're experiencing the loss of a loved one, of a job, of a part of themselves in some way, whether that's that they're aging. That's a very big one. We see that a lot in our community, where age is not respected, where elder state, where that place of taking your elder power, we don't give that in our community particularly easily. As a mainstream community, we begin to devalue elder people because we feel that they are no longer part of the productive system that our very capitalized mainstream society has chosen to value. And that can bring in an immense amount of grief in elder people. And by elder, I'm talking even from 45 up. I'm not necessarily talking about 90-year-olds, women and men, both being seen as much more valuable when they're younger in their big productive years. So grief can come in because of age, grief can come in because of loss of social connections. So really wide understanding of grief. So as that comes into our systems, knowing how to help move it on, knowing how to help stabilize it and move it from that place of internalizing the grief into beginning to allow it to balance and expand it into trust, is a very natural process, and for many people can be quite a trying one. Trust has an energy of innocence or rebirth to it, and grief has the opposite. It has the energy of experience through pain and the deep wisdoms of that. So there's a rebirthing process that goes on whenever we are able to move from grief to trust. That is a good cup of tea to know. Sarah, you're asking, what happens to our energies when we cry because we are grieving? It feels like a release of energy. I feel calmer after I cry, more grounded. But I'd love to know what you see in our energies when we have a good cry. Absolutely. I would say absolutely what you have written, and so what you intuitively know about your energy system is very, very true for most people. Now, there's crying and there's crying. There is transformative crying, and there's non-transformative crying. I can't think of a word for it, but there's times when actually that emotion has been building within us and it's looking for transformation. It's looking for movement so that the whole system can integrate that emotion. And when we cry like that, then those running tears really are that water of rebirth. They're the water of the new beginning. The ability for the energy system and your psyche to begin to integrate some of where that grief is coming from. There's also crying when that really isn't transformational. It's a crying that moves internally as well, and we all know it. It's the crying that holds self-pity. Yeah, that's not transformative. When we cry in self-pity, and I'm going to absolutely say I've experienced that in my life, and I fully trust that everybody else have. When we cry in self-pity, then actually it's like we're adding more energy into the story that we have about, poor me, I'm feeling so much grief in this situation. So that's a very, very different energy, and it affects our system differently. That's not transformative. That doesn't help bring healing. That's not to say that sometimes it's not perfectly necessary because we're down in the pits and we just need to feel that. That's okay. But it's getting from that place into the transformation of the understanding. Yeah, all of our emotions have the ability to gift us understandings about ourselves or about the world we live in, about how we experience things. So it really is about, if I see somebody crying, and actually crying's really healthy. If I see someone crying, I usually see it's a really beautiful sign of their healing. Then when someone is crying, it's like the system is beginning to cycle differently. It's moving, it's integrating. I've talked about the crying of self-pity. There's also the crying that's kind of, what's the word for it? It's kind of explosive crying. It would be the crying that we might think of as being cathartic, that it feels like it's just moving loads of stuff. And actually, that doesn't often move stuff either. That kind of crying in its intensity is much closer to self-pity. It's much closer to drama. It's much closer to the, oh, I need to express all of this emotion. Again, fine, we've all been there, and that's totally fine, but it's not transformative. So Sarah, when you're talking about feeling better after a cry, feeling more grounded, and that's the key, because if you cry in a non-transformative way, you won't feel grounded. You won't actually feel better afterwards. You'll feel like you shifted some emotion, but quite soon it will become apparent that that emotion holds some toxicity and hasn't aided the situation that you were in. Okay. Katie, hi Katie, you're saying, can you say something about a person who's preparing to die and who grieves this transition? Absolutely. I guess that really is a hub situation, a nutshell situation for moving from grief into trust. As someone who is supporting someone in that situation, then holding space for their grief for the life they're leaving, really important, but also holding space and having them bring some consciousness to where they're moving to, what might be the next step. And even if they have no spiritual belief and the next step is final, then can they come in some ways to feeling like, okay, well, that's me returning to the natural cycle. Yeah, is their life experience that they've had with other people or animals or plants or their connections to the season where they can actually feel a level of trust in the process of life. All things die and are born again. All things are born and die again. So there is a real, it's a very fundamental shift from grief to trust in their process. And of course, in our life, death is pretty uncool. We don't talk about death. It's a big taboo in our society. Even having a conversation with friends or family, what do you want to do when you die? Do you want to be cremated? Do you want to be buried? There are death cafes that are increasingly popular simply to give people a forum to go and chat about death. Because really, in our modern day language, we really don't get much opportunity to explore something that is totally a part of life. And so supporting someone in that situation who is transitioning from physical life into death. There's also the amazing Felicity Warner has the Death Midwives Society, and there are death doulas and just some amazing understandings and work that you can do to help someone in that situation, or if you're in that situation, be supported in it. Carol, you're asking, in a time of grief, we can go through anger. Is this anger connected to liver processing the toxin of loss? Not often, Carol, much more. It's when we feel angry about grief. Anger is a powerful energizer in our system. So anger is actually a really, really healthy emotion when we're experiencing grief. Not sustained anger, that's not what I'm talking about, but to feel that upwelling of anger. Anger helps energy move. So when I was talking about grief getting static, grief can be a very, very still energy, and it kind of drips down into the deepest level of our being and can get really slow and stuck there, kind of shadowing all of our experiences. Anger comes along and it creates movement. So then we have to deal with the grief. Yeah, anger is a big gift in that respect. So it's not about toxicity. It's about the liver energy, which is so associated with anger, actually helping the system move in order to rebalance. Okay, Rob, you're asking, how much do you think grief is playing a major role in the disconnect people are feeling now, as there is so much divisiveness within families, within communities? I think you've got it absolutely right, Rob. Grief as disconnect is massive. And, that's the purpose of my work. That's the purpose of these Facebook Lives, because there are so many of us who experience that lack of connection. And we know on a fundamental level, all of us humans know that's not healthy. That's not nourishing us. At the same time, the big question of what do we do about it can be so massive as to be overwhelming. So absolutely, that grief from nature, grief from human connection, grief that you might live in a street and not know your neighbors, that separation, absolutely, really fundamental in feeling ourselves to be isolated, not having that feeling of essential belonging. All right. So maybe let's think about, now we've talked about the different ways grief can come in. How about we look at ways to shift it because we want to. One of the most simple, and I brought this forward in other ones, but I want to share it again now because we're going to look at a couple of them, is simply to cross your hands over and come up with your fingers under your armpits and your thumbs on your chest. And don't worry about where they fall. Obviously here we're connecting the lungs and the heart, and we're bringing in this big heart hug. Now, many of you will just feel great if you bring a rock in here. Some of you will rock forward and backward. Some of you will rock side to side. Either way, fine. Some of you will be still. But this can be an amazing way to support the lungs and the heart in processing the emotion of grief. And while you're doing this, you can even consider what trust would look like. If you experience the fullness of trust in your energy system right now, in your life right now, what would that mean? What would be different? And don't be surprised if you feel at some point a deep breath as your system grabs that idea of trust. You know, nature abhors a vacuum, and that's very true of your energy system as well. So anytime you're able to release some emotion, such as grief, then something has to come in behind it. And when we've already brought consciousness to trust in whatever, trust in a cosmic plan, trust in our community or our family or our friends to support us, trust in the oxygen to be there for us to breathe, trust that the sun will come up tomorrow. Whatever the trust place is for us, if we can just drop into that place, wow, so much can rebalance in our system. Remember at all times that your energy system is designed to be healthy. Your body is designed to be healthy. And anything off that path of health is simply needing rebalancing. So when you give it some opportunity to rebalance, your body will leap on that opportunity. There's another exercise I want to bring in, and this is one of Donna Eden's exercise. And it's a beautiful, beautiful way to rebalance grief in the energy system. So I'm going to move back a little bit here. You're going to bring your hands together. So I'm going to make a kind of circle in front of my chest. And let's take a lovely breath in here. And as you breathe out, you're going to open your chest right up. So my arms are now right out. Breathing in. Bring your fingers to touch again. Breathing out. Opening right up. So you can continue. This is a way of working the lungs, working the chest as you breathe, opening to trust, and then coming back into the place that your energy system is, wherever that is, opening to trust. You can see that you're putting your arms around your world, your private world, your individual world, and then you're opening your arms up to the great world out there. You're going to find your way with the breath. Some people find that when you open up, you want to breathe out. Other people find that when they open up, they want to breathe in. So you're going to find your way of moving your system from grief to trust. Oh, that feels so nice. All right. So let me see. Yeah, there's some great questions that have come in now. So Lisa, yeah, absolutely. Lisa, you're saying that after a loss of someone that you love, that you feel frozen. Absolutely. That's exactly what I was talking about, that place of brittleness or stuckness. So do those exercises. It's not going to be immediate. Yeah. It's not going to be that, oh, you've done half an hour of this Facebook Live and now all of that grief's gone. But keep working with it. Invite in what you want in your life, even as you recognize and honor what you've lost. Okay. Fabulous. All right. Well, that is up to 7 o'clock. So we'll stop here. See you again in a couple of weeks. And thank you so much for joining me. Really beautiful to be able to share these insights with you. Okay. Bye-bye.